So welcome everyone to this webinar for August, and I'll just bring up the front slide for today. So today we're having a research fireside chat. My name's Wendy Tallio and I'm your host today, and I've got Heck monitoring the chat window, and Colin's also my co-anchor today. So this webinar is going to have two parts. The first part is an open mic, sort of sharing your research. Part two will be discussing these two questions. What are the research needs of this community, and what research could benefit advisors most? So be prepared to get your mics on and chatting for part two. So we've just got about 15 minutes to go, and we're going to start with the first question on our discussion board, which is, what are the research needs of this community? So I'm going to set about 6 minutes for this conversation. You can use the mic, you can use the chat window, and you can keep in mind maybe research that you're doing in addition to what we've seen today.
I mean, I would say at a broad level, one of our biggest challenges is how well our roles are understood. I mean, Kate and Chair and I did a little bit of research a while ago about just the number of titles there are for advisors, and we identified 40 or 50, and obviously all of the work that people are doing to try and clarify and define what the roles mean. To me, that's really valuable, because at the end of the day, if an academic is sitting in their office going, no one's paying attention to my lecture, what can I do to improve this? Who do I go and talk to? And if they don't have the answer, I should go and talk to a learning designer, then yeah, like we're kind of sitting there waiting for something to happen. So that's why I think particularly clarifying and understanding and what it is that we do is particularly valuable.
Thanks, Colin. Does anyone else have any other response to the research needs? Kate was thinking the same thing. Alison said, how do we provide evidence of our impact? So Irene is suggesting a survey of the literature.
Yeah, hi Wendy. Can I just elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, what I meant by that is that if you look at all these journal articles, and there's no shortage of them in this area, particularly in terms of this question, if you go to the very last paragraph of any journal, it'll always say, and further research is needed in ... And it seems to me that the field of educational design is so diverse that somehow or other somebody putting together a review of the literature about this would be really helpful. I'm not aware of any, maybe others are, but I thought that might be a good starting point.
Thanks, Irina. I always read those, yeah, further research needed with interest, but how to match that with anybody who actually took up that challenge is certainly interesting. Does anyone want to say anything more about the evidence of impact or how we could capture that?
Yes, it's Jenny. Hi, Wendy. Hi, Irina. Hi, Colin. I was just going to say the roles are really important, and the literature is also really important, but also if we're thinking more systemically and how we're actually positioned in an institution.
Do you mean the name of the role, or
no, I guess
the real question?
how are we situated in terms of our roles?
So give me an example. So give me an example.
Okay, so for example, at the moment I'm working at the Deakin University at a place called Global Studio, and so we focusing on producing MOOCs via FutureLearn platform.
Yes.
So it's a large team of roughly 20 people with a very different set of expertise. So anything from learning technologists to senior learning designers and operations and anything in between. But unfortunately, we don't operate in isolation. So we deal with a lot of different faculties, professional units, student support services, and so forth on a daily basis. So I guess part of what we need to research is how does that system work, you know, at a larger level, and why do the roles, I guess, exist, which links to some of the research being presented today. But also, why do we work the way we work, and why do we use certain tools, I guess, and artifacts as part of our daily practice?
Great, thank you. So Craig's mentioned that sometimes people just don't know that advisor type people do exist. It's another reason for having some visibility of work. Does anyone else want to grab the mic? Colin's mentioned to answer about the role, sort of what team do you belong to? Are you centralised or decentralised? Do you work side by side with learning designers or with education technologists or learning technologists, to mix those terms up?
Yeah, this is all a big part of the work that I'm particularly interested in. I just wanted to come back very quickly to the impact question, because I thought that was really useful, and I think that's a really important part of how we demonstrate our value to the institution. And actually, I just wanted to go off on a little tangent very, very, very quickly, which was we're trying to identify ways at the moment that the TELedvisors group is having impact. So we'll put out a call shortly, but if you have actually taken action as a result of going to a webinar or seeing something on the forum, or you've connected with someone, yeah, we'll be asking for those kind of stories soon, because I think being able to demonstrate impact is actually really useful.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out there, Colin, and maybe we could have sort of a template of a story card that people could fill out to give us those stories. So yeah, I might work on that, thinking out loud. So unless anyone has any more questions or details on that one, I'd like to move on to the second question.
Could I perhaps just offer one last hint, maybe?
Sure. Go ahead, Peter.
Sometimes it's difficult to get consistency across different organisations with different structures and different roles. What I found back in my marketing days was that if you find something is interesting and effective and you shout out about it, a lot of other people will be interested to hear about it. So my observation is that many universities, or most if not all, will have some form of social media or shout out capability on their, at least on their internal intranet. So if you see or hear of anything interesting, or if you've done anything that's interesting to you, then your interest will percolate through that and make other people interested. So sometimes you don't need to wait for research or data to come out. If you just think it's cool, shout out about the fact that it's cool, and that will help you a lot.
Thanks, Peter. I think that's quite important. Not that anybody here is shy, but I think that it's perhaps we do need to work on the visibility. I know Colin in his corner has made a poster, and put that up on the wall to advertise TELedvisors. And we'd certainly encourage other people to do that, but perhaps run it past the community before you post it so that we can get consistency with you know, labelling and the wording of that. But definitely put your thinking caps on for visibility of our work. Okay, I'm just going to go to the second question, which is what research would benefit advisors most? So we have been talking a little bit around that, but it would really help us and the community if you could maybe type in some you know, potential titles of research papers. How about that? Research is being underpaid or not paid, for sure. And Kate points out that our membership, if we look at people logging into Moodle, is going up, which is great. And we also want to get more of the non-active members to log in and start working with the community.
I say you did make a very important point there, Wendy, which is the fact that it is actually quite difficult for a lot of advisors to be allowed to do research as part of their work when we're sitting in professional roles. I feel like I've been very lucky here at Monash. There's a very good culture around encouraging that. I know that's the exception to the rule. So I guess one thing I would suggest, not a specific research project, but for the academics in the group who do have a little bit more capacity to support research projects, certainly look at bringing professional staff on board with those projects, just so that people get a bit more experience, they get some publications, and maybe we can slowly change the culture and demonstrate the value of having professional staff doing research as well.
Yes, thanks, Colin. I will share a little bit of my experience, if that's okay. So I've just finished my Master of Arts in Online and Distance Education through Open University UK. Part of that was looking at a research plan. So that's going back probably 3 years now. I started with the research plan, and at the end of my Masters I thought, well, I'll just try and, you know, do the research now and write it up. I've been through 2 Askellite mentoring programs, and 1 year of that mentoring program was just trying to get it through ethics, where it got knocked back for things like you don't have an academic in the same university who's research experienced as the prime person, so therefore go and get one of those. Well, I got one of those, that didn't work. So lots of ethics boundaries, hurdles, and as of now I've finally got a paper written and into Askellite for reviewing. So it's been a really interesting journey, and one of my main drivers was just to see whether I wanted to do this ever again. That's still on the burner. So the challenge for professional roles and being able to have forms that you can even tick the box. For example, the ethics form from our university has a box if you're a HDR student at the university, but no other box saying that you're a professional person who has extensive experience in the field. And even though my PVC agreed that person in my role would be the best person to research a tool embedded into the LMS, that doesn't necessarily have weight when it goes through to the ethics committee. Yes, Henk, I'm still, I don't know. Don't know about giving up.
Hey, Wendy, can I make an observation again, please?
Sure, go ahead.
Sometimes if you're in a professional role and you're trying to cross the boundary into doing an academic paper, it is very difficult, as you've experienced.
Well, I don't agree with the boundary, but yeah. Yep.
Something where I've had some success is if you're in a professional role, you can often use professional style artifacts to get your research or observations noticed, like using case studies, for example, or using a business case template rather than an academic paper template. Because if you're professional staff and you can be seen to be doing a case study into effectiveness, then that's going to be less likely to raise any objections or barriers, in my experience.
Yeah, that's a good point, Peter. I guess I would add to that is there's a difference between what my role is here and what I consider myself. So the organisation is in a way enforcing a certain protocol, saying that I'm not an academic just because of the role that I currently have. So I think there's an interesting, which is one reason why I think a lot of people are looking at what's the name of the role, what's the evidence of the impact of the role, what does the role actually do, because it's not as clear as having a discipline-based heading over your head. Just reading some of the chat here. So Hank said there's an academic element to the role, and I would certainly find that even in a support role where you're drawn into conversations on pedagogy, etc. Anyone else want to take the mic on research that could benefit advisors? So the credibility factor, I'm still getting my head around that whole academic credibility and how that goes. Research on what the research needs are, yes. So we've probably got another 30 seconds. Getting academics to engage in scholarship of teaching and learning projects. Alison earlier talked about the indirect impacts. That's probably one reason why it's a bit hard to measure. Practitioner research being discouraged. Richard, did you want to talk a bit more about that? How it impacts the research rankings?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think the problem is that certainly two universities I've worked at, they've really actively discouraged research because they want staff to do subject research instead within their particular disciplines. And the stuff that they're doing, which is kind of pedagogically related, they are just told, well, you can do that, but it won't count towards your research evaluation. So they don't.
Yeah.
If you've got education as a discipline within your university, that's great. If you haven't, then it's a problem.
Yes.
That was the experience I had at ANU. Yeah, ANU doesn't have education faculty, and I was actively told that if we were publishing education research, it would bring our overall rating down, which is kind of...
Yeah, that's still the message. So the answer is to get it done somewhere else.
But even if you have an education faculty, it's getting them to understand ed tech, which is the trick, because it's not, you know, ed tech's not a discipline, so they go, well, you don't belong in our faculty directly.
Well, the problem is most education faculties that I've encountered in Australia are primary or secondary teacher training. They're not necessarily involved in education research of this sort. You know, if you wanted to do stuff on how things work in schools, great. But if you want to do things on higher education research, there are very few places doing that. I think Melbourne does some, in Sydney.
Do you think there's more visibility in North America and Europe?
Certainly, yes, there is in the UK, because it's my experience, where we've got a fairly well established. So the role of, that's interesting, the role of educational technologist advisor, wherever else you want to call them. I've encountered far more of that sort of person here than I did in the UK. They were a relatively rare species, certainly 5 years ago, because a lot more of that stuff is kind of done possibly by academic staff, possibly by other people. But it's certainly it's a reason that they exist, I suspect, is because there's a huge gap, because people aren't doing that sort of research or that sort of work.
Yes, and we could give a shout out to the Alt-C conference.
Yeah, absolutely.
on the next week, Wednesday and Thursday, it starts about 6 p.m. around Australian time. So definitely hook into that if you can. Most of it's live streamed, and they have good back channeling, they have good Twitter, they have good ability to hook into some of the sessions, and that's certainly something that I think we can learn from in Australia conferences.
Well, a lot of good stuff came out of things like that as well in the UK. And the Teaching Learning Technology program, which ran for quite a few years.
Okay, we're going to wrap up here. I think the conversation has been really beneficial, but the challenge is now what to do with that conversation, because we have had these conversations before. We've got a Padlet wall, which I'll dig out of the www archives and share with everyone. But what I really need now is some ideas of how to progress these ideas and not just have the conversation and finish it there. So I think the sharing that we had in the first half hour is really great, because we've got some recordings that we can share. We won't be sharing the recording of the discussion. That's more for the community to make value of. Yeah, who is looking for help? Definitely. So this is me signing off. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you in the forums.